Vice Chair, the meeting is live now.
Thank you, Haruka. And I call a meeting of Halifax and West Community Council to order for October 12th. And do we need to do a little roll call first, or can we go to the approval of the minutes?
Up to you, Vice Chair.
Okay, I think we have everyone. We've heard briefly from everyone, so I'll go right to the approval of the minutes then, please.
I'd like to move the approval of the minutes as distributed. Or wait, I'm supposed to do order of business first, I think. Oh, no, minutes, sorry.
Yes.
Second.
Thank you. Councillors Mason and Stoddard, thank you. Approval of the minutes. Now for the approval of the order of business and approval of additions and deletions, we're going to change the order of business for tonight. So we will be going to case 13.1.1, case 2366-1 before we go to our public hearing in order to allow time for all councillors to join us. Could I get approval for this change in the order of business, please?
Excuse me, Madam Vice Chair. Vote has to happen to approve the minutes of September 21st as distributed, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we did that. So could I?
Question on the approval of minutes as presented.
Okay, sorry. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Minutes are approved. Thank you.
So I would like to make a motion to approve the order of business and but to move item 13.1.1 to before section 10 public hearings.
Could I have a seconder?
No second.
Thank you, Councillor Stoddard. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Hearing none. Any motions of reconsideration? None. Motions of rescission? None. Consideration of deferred business? None. Notices of tabled matters? None. So that takes us then to, sorry. 13.1.1, case 23661, non-substantive amendments to an existing development agreement at 286 and 290 Herring Cove Road, Halifax. Shall I read the motion, or would someone like to put the motion on the floor?
I can do that. So I move that Halifax and West Community Council, 1, approve by resolution the proposed amending development agreement, which shall be substantially of the same form as set out in attachment A of the staff report dated August 18, 2021, and 2, require the amending development agreement be signed by the property owners within 240 days or any extensions thereof granted by council on request of the property owner from the date of final approval by council and any other bodies as necessary, including applicable appeal periods, whichever is later. Otherwise, this approval will be void and obligations arising hereunder shall be at an end.
Second.
Thank you, Councillors Cleary and Mason.
So very quickly on this one, we discussed this, I believe, at our last meeting, and now staff have brought the actual development agreement to us. The only change is in the date to push this forward. Everything else remains as it was approved, I think, in 2014.
So it's just a change of date that we're talking about here?
Just an extension of the development agreement.
And we need to vote on that then?
We do.
Okay.
Question?
Question. All those in favor of changing the date?
Yes.
Aye.
Aye. If I may, Madam Chair, I was
Yes.
going to speak, but I can speak afterwards.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You have to have your chat up. So I just wanted to point out to the very few people who are watching right now, there may be some media watching the YouTube. There's a lot of pushback last week when I said at council that there's lots of stuff that's approved and not being built. A lot of people questioned where I got those figures. We're getting a lot of detail about that. That'll be released to the public by the CAO shortly, but ta-da, we just pushed something from 2014 farther into the future. It's 2021, right? So like these are the examples of stuff I think we really need to dig into to understand why we have approvals but not starts for a lot of stuff that seemed like it was a slam dunk when we approved it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So we have now approved this, and is there anything else we need to do to finalize this particular case?
Nope, that's it.
We're done. Okay. Very good. And can we move now to 10.1 to our public hearing?
Yes, that is correct, Vice Chair. Also, I also wanted to confirm if Councillor Smith is in attendance.
Yeah, still here. I'm gonna find a place to open up my computer. So just give me 2 minutes. But we can do like what time is it? 6:10. That will give me enough time to find a parking lot.
Okay. Shall we just take a 2-minute break then? Is everyone comfortable with that?
Well, if you'd
All
like
right.
to, Madam Chair, you could
Yes.
run through the rest of the agenda where,
Okay.
because I think a lot of it's none.
All right, will do. So while we're waiting for Councillor Smith, 10.2 variance hearing is none. 11 correspondence, petitions, and delegations. Clerk?
Thank you, Vice Chair. There was one piece of correspondence that has been received. It was for item 10.1.1, and it was circulated to the Community Council.
Thank you very much. Petitions and presentations, none. And information items brought forward, none. Are there any reports?
There was only 13.1.1, so all the item was dealt with.
Very good. Okay, thank you. And shall I run through 14 through 18?
Maybe 14, 15, and 16.
Okay. Motions, there are none. In camera, no. Added items. Are there any added items?
There is no added item.
Okay. Very good.
You are the best, Chair. This is going so quickly. We're all very impressed.
Yeah. Thank you for those in the public who are bearing with me. This is only my second time pitch hitting as chair. So we're just waiting briefly for the public hearing to begin. And we should be ready momentarily.
And for our regular chair to find a parking spot.
I got my computer in hand now, and I'm just turning it on.
All right. Hello, hello.
Oh,
All right, you can hear me.
We can hear you, and I'm happy to turn over the chair to you, Chair Smith.
All right, sounds good. I'm not going to give you the unflattering position that I am in at the moment.
That's fine.
You probably don't want to look at my nose hairs. So, yeah, it's funny, just as an interesting piece, now that we're seeing more travel, you have family members who come for Thanksgiving, and then they forget that they have to be at the airport. And of course, you're the one that has to be the one to get them there. So sorry, I'm not able to we're kind of a little messy tonight, but you know, family first. So if we can move to the public hearing. So I am here verbally. You can't see me, but I am here. So I'm assuming this counts as me being in attendance. And we're on to 10.1.1, case 23528, land use bylaw amendment rezoning for 1601 Ketch Harbor Road, Sambro. And as always, we have a procedure for our public hearings, which is we start with staff presentation, give the applicant an opportunity to present up to 10 minutes, and then go to our public hearing speakers list. As a reminder, all those watching from home, in order to have signed up as a speaker, the deadline was 4:30 p.m. This is the day prior to the hearing. It was October 8th, Friday, and we currently have 2 speakers registered for this public hearing. So we'll start with the staff presentation, which I believe, yep, I see Peter. Hello, Peter, you're there. And I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, Mr. Chair. Just to double check that everyone can see my screen. Okay.
Yep.
Very good. Thank you. So yes, I am Peter Nightingale. I'm a planner here this evening on behalf of the Rural Policy and Planning Applications team, and here this evening regarding a public hearing for case 23528, which is a rezoning application for 1601 Ketch Harbor Road in Sambro. So the applicant, Stephen Adams Consulting Services Incorporated, has applied to rezone 1601 Ketch Harbor Road from the existing P2 Community Facility Zone to R6 Rural Residential in order to allow a fishery support use, which would include the storage of fishing gear, nets, traps, boats, and other equipment related to a local fishery operation. Subject property is located in the community of Sambro, shown here, outlined in red on this map, just before you get to the bridge in the Sambro village area. This is an aerial photograph of the site showing the property. You can see there is an existing garage building on the property and a gravel parking area. And the back half of the property, in behind that building, there's a rock embankment which slopes down, in the bottom of which there's a wetland area and a water course. So although it looks somewhat dry in this aerial photograph, this is a photo I took while I was on site. So really, once you get to the bottom of that slope, there is a wetland on the property which continues in behind that property and connects to that. So the back half of this property would be a wetland watercourse area. So the current zone that's applied to the property is the P2 Community Facility Zone. And this zone was applied in 2008 when the property was rezoned from the prior C2 General Commercial Zone that had been on the property since the Municipal Planning Strategy and Land Use Bylaw were adopted in the 90s. This zone, the P2 zone, was applied to allow a social club to locate on the property as a way to repurpose this existing building. The property is located in the residential designation, and the existing use of the site is a vacant building. And the enabling policy that allows council to consider this rezoning application is Implementation Policy 6, which is our application of abutting zone policy, and I'll get into that in a little more detail later on. This is what the planning process looks like for this rezoning application. So we've done our internal staff review and consulted with our review agencies and completed a public engagement. And we were at Halifax and West Community Council last month for first reading, and here this evening for the public hearing. After the decision of council, after the public hearing, there's a 14-day appeal period during which the applicant or any affected member of the public could appeal council's decision. And if that process results in approval of the rezoning to the R6 zone, then the property owner is free to commence their fishery support use on the property. In this case, there are no permits required for fishery support use. They would need permits for any construction. If they were doing any renovations or building anything, they would still need a building permit, but fishery support use is exempt from development permit requirements in this plan area. So going into a little bit more detail about the proposal itself, I mentioned that this property is currently zoned P2 and has been since 2008. And the building itself dates back well before the land use bylaw was adopted in 1995, and it's seen various uses over the years. It was originally, I think, used as a store when the land use bylaw was adopted. So that was why the C2 general commercial zone was laid down initially, and then later rezoned to allow a reuse of that building. The applicant is asking for this rezoning to R6 so that they can use the property for a fishery support use, which is a fishery support use pertains to an individual fisher and the types of things that they need to do to support their fishery operation. It's not a commercial fishery use like you would see in a larger scale a little further down the road here, along such as the Sambro fisheries and some of those big operations down the road. That's a commercial fishery use. Fishery support use is a much smaller scale type of use, as I mentioned, to support the individual fisher. So this fishery support use would allow the property owner to either use the existing building or remove that and construct a new building on the property for the maintenance and storage of fishing equipment and gear, boats, things like that. They can also store those things outdoors on the property. They can park boats, they can store traps, do things of that nature. And one key difference with the R6 zone versus the other residential zones in the area is that the R6 zone also allows retail or wholesale of fish products. So a fishery support use is allowed on all residential properties in this plan area, but the R6 zone takes that a little bit further by also allowing for retail and wholesale of fish. When we looked at the policy considerations for this request, the rezoning, as I mentioned, is enabled under policy IM6, which is an implementation policy. And this policy provides the opportunity for the development of similar uses on properties which abut one another. And it allows council to consider amendments to the land use bylaw within a designation to provide for the development of uses permitted by the zone on the abutting property, which is a fairly confusing way of saying the property next door is zoned R6. Therefore, it enables council to consider essentially pulling that R6 zone over onto this property. So the neighbor has R6 and that zoning line can be expanded to incorporate neighboring properties. The public engagement for this application consisted of a mail out to property owners surrounding the subject site. We sent a letter out to 37 property owners or occupants, sort of detailing the proposal, the request for the rezoning and what the fishery support use entailed. And from those letters, we received either phone calls or emails from 6 individuals that had comments that they wanted to provide to staff on the request for rezoning. So just really quickly talking about what those concerns and what the feedback from the community were, I would kind of place that into 4 broad groups that we heard from. The first being the scale of a fishery support use and whether or not that's compatible with the surrounding residential properties. There were concerns about traffic safety and specifically with large trucks frequenting the site and concerns about a lot of trucks parking here and pulling out on a Ketch Harbor Road and what that might mean for traffic safety in the area. Concerns about noise from trucks, but also from refrigeration equipment, which might be operating, which could disturb nearby property owners. And finally, environmental impacts of allowing this type of use on property. There were concerns about storing fish products and gear and things like that, and what that could mean for the wetland in behind the building, whether there could be a discharge into the environment or leaks or things like that that could impact the environment around here. And I'll just get a little bit deeper into a couple of these issues and go into some detail about what we heard and how we can respond to that. So the first big issue that we heard a lot about was really about this being a residential area. The properties around here are residential properties. Most of the properties in this community are within an R2 zone or an R2A zone, which allows various residential uses. They all allow fishery support uses, but the R6 zone, like I mentioned earlier, is a little bit different because it allows a slightly more intense type of operation than the other residential zones do. And I have a couple photos here that I took when I was out in the community, just to kind of demonstrate the scale that we're talking about when we talk about a fishery support use. So these are two properties, very close proximity to the subject site. You can see the one on the left here. They've got their traps in the yard, some pallets, large gravel area where they may do park their boat when it's out of the water, things like that. And then the property on the right here showing they've got a wharf with traps on it. There's a building. Now, obviously, the subject property doesn't have any water frontage, so there's not going to be a wharf. But this is kind of to demonstrate when we say that a fishery support use is going to be enabled, this is the scale we're talking about, not the type of thing you'd see down the road at the government wharf, where you've got big, large buildings and processing facilities and things like that. Another thing that we heard a lot about was the noise from refrigeration units. So there were concerns where this is a residential area that this type of operation would have reefer trucks parked in the property, and those units would be running constantly and disturbing the peace and quiet in the neighborhood. So the noise itself isn't something that's regulated by the land use bylaw. The land use bylaw regulates the uses that are permitted and the types of restrictions that are on those, but it doesn't speak to noise. So this is regulated under the noise bylaw. And I reached out to our municipal compliance division to get a little bit more information about how that would apply to an operation such as this. And they confirmed that refrigeration equipment can be operated in a residential area, but there are restrictions on the hours that you're allowed to do that. So on weekdays, you're not allowed to run this type of equipment before 7 a.m. and after 9:30 p.m., before 8 a.m. and after 7 on Saturdays, and you're not allowed to run it at all on Sundays and holidays. And I'll clarify where this is the noise bylaw. It's about the noise that's created from these, not the actual use of refrigeration units. So for example, if they had an electric refrigeration unit in their building that didn't make any noise, that's not a violation of the noise bylaw. But if they have a diesel powered reefer truck or some kind of refrigeration unit outside that has an engine that's making noise, that's when it is triggering the noise bylaw requirements that would apply to this property. And I'll also clarify, even if this property is rezoned to R6, it remains a residential property, a residential area. So the noise bylaw is really, there are sort of different scales of what's permitted in different areas. And one of the metrics that's used is there are certain things that are allowed in a residential area. So this will continue to be a residential area, and this property will continue to be regulated under those restrictions that apply to residential areas under the noise bylaw. Finally, we heard from members of the public concerns about how this would impact the wetland behind the property. And I showed you the images of that earlier. We heard from people who said that there's quite a diverse habitat here. There's different sorts of migratory birds and things like that that use the area. And there were concerns about what would happen if there were fish stored on the property, or there was runoff, or things were leaking and discharging into the environment. And I wanted to clarify what falls under the municipality's regulations and what would be regulated by other bodies such as the province. So this property is subject to our watercourse buffer requirements under the land use bylaw. The existing building and gravel area that are there, those predate our watercourse buffer requirements. So essentially they're grandfathered in. They can continue to exist, they can change use, but they cannot further encroach into the watercourse buffer than they are today. So they can continue to exist, but essentially they can't make the situation any worse than what they see today. So they couldn't build an extension on the back of the building or anything of that nature. Other aspects, if they wanted to do alterations to the wetland or do any infilling or anything like that, those things are regulated by the Provincial Department of Nova Scotia Environment and Climate Change. And they would need appropriate permissions from them to do any sort of alterations like that to the wetland. And finally, if there was a situation where something leaked or there was some kind of discharge into the environment, that falls under provincial environmental regulations, and any type of violation like that would be investigated by Nova Scotia Environment Climate Change and followed up accordingly, whether they issued an order to remedy things or bring the property into compliance or whatever the provincial department felt was necessary to achieve compliance for any issues that may potentially happen on this property. So based on the foregoing, staff are recommending that Halifax and West Community Council adopt the amendment to the land use bylaw for Planning District 5 as set out in Attachment A of the staff report. Thank you very much for your time and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Peter. Very great presentation, informative. Are there any questions? I should open the chat. Oh, I don't want to share. Any questions from councilors? Councilor Cleary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick one. So just to confirm, R6 is still residential. There's no commercial activities, things that could support fishing, not commercial fishing. You mentioned several times the concerns of the local residents around refrigerated trucks. Is if there's no processing, and I just, because I didn't hear you say, you know, that could or couldn't happen on the property. So I just want to clarify. If there's no processing of commercial like fish on the property, would we expect there to be refrigerated trucks on the property? I mean, when I think of storing gear and boats, I think of traps and lines and rope, and I don't think refrigerated trucks. So just where did that concern come from? And is that a reasonable concern? Because you didn't really address that, Mr. Nightingale.
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councilor's question, so the fishery support use does allow for processing of the fisher's own catch. So the individual fisher that this use is intended to support, they're allowed to process their own catch and ship it out. And now the other thing that's a little bit different about the R6 zone compared to the other residential zones is it allows the retail and wholesale of fish and fish products. So it's certainly conceivable for that type of operation or even for the processing that there may be refrigeration equipment that will be required. The other concern we had from some members of the community would be ice making equipment. So for boats going out, they need a significant quantity of ice to go out with them to support them while they're out at sea. And you know, apparently it's been an issue in that there's been a shortage of ice, and so there was concern they might expand that to this area. So largely that's where those concerns came from. Certainly, I think some type of refrigeration equipment could be compatible with a fishery support use. But I guess the one thing I would say maybe a bit further to that is because of the restrictions on the hours of operations for refrigeration equipment, if you are storing fish here, you don't have the option to turn your refrigeration unit off at night to comply with the bylaw and turn it back on in the morning. Any type of equipment like that needs to be running 24/7. So if they do end up with any type of refrigeration equipment, I would imagine that given the requirements to have it running all the time, they would have to go with some sort of an electric refrigeration unit or something that's not going to be having that engine running. Really, the concern was about trucks and trailers parked in the property that would be running. And again, you know, I could see that type of activity. If there's fish stored at the site, a refrigeration truck might pull in, load up, drive away. And as long as that's within the hours of operation where that's permitted, that would be acceptable, but it couldn't happen after hours.
Okay. And so I just wanted that confirmation. So the owner or the resident could do some processing, but only of their own catch, correct, no others, because that would then be considered commercial if you take someone else's catch. Right. And so whatever happens there would be very limited in scale to his own, I'm assuming it's their own processing. And okay, so those were obviously brought up by the residents. So you've talked about those. And just for folks watching from home, Councillor Cuddle, whose area this is, asked me to ask those questions because those were concerns residents brought to our attention. So I appreciate the answer to those, Mr. Nightingale. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So looking at the land use bylaw, what was unclear to me is does the C2 zone in District 5 allow the fisheries support or fisheries work? So the commercial zone includes retail and all that stuff, and then near the bottom it has marinas, boatyards, marine repair related operations. It doesn't seem to mention fisheries at all. Just trying to wonder, you know, because when you look on Google Street View, you see the commercial one just like 100 feet away down the road, and it has what looks to me like you know, there's lobster traps in front of one of the homes there. It might not be on the commercial site. What's the difference between commercial and residential when it comes to fisheries uses in District 5? Thank you.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, to the councilor's question. Looking just quickly at the C2 zone, The language it uses is a little bit different. So it doesn't specifically allow a fishery use or a fishery support use. It does allow things like marinas, boatyards, marine repair related operations. So I did see the property across the street that's in the C2 zone and some of the activity that they seem to have on that site. What I don't know off the top of my head is whether that use existed prior to the land use bylaw being adopted in '95, right, or whether that was something new that came up. But to my knowledge, we haven't had any complaints about new operations starting up there that might not comply with the land use bylaw. So if it's certainly possible that the scale of what's going on in that property may be a little bit outside of what the C2 zone allows, but short of looking into the permitting history, if there is any on that property and sort of the historical factors, I couldn't say whether
didn't want to pick on that one property. Just wanted to know if
Yes.
C2 could include fishery stuff, and the answer is maybe it's not clear.
Yes, to some degree, I think there are fishery related things that could likely happen there, but it talks about it as a different class of use.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor, I don't see anybody else in the chat. Anyone else question clarification? No, really quickly, Peter, just to touch on one piece. You did mention that the wholesale of the catch from the individual would be able to be sold on the property, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's correct, Mr. Chair. I'll clarify that point a little bit because I think it bears repeating. All properties, so all residential properties that allow a fishery support use allows for the sale of an individual fisher's catch is the way it's worded. So in other words, the individual fisher can park his truck or her truck, and you see that a lot of times in rural communities that you've got people selling product off the back of a truck or what have you. So in all residential zones, that's allowed, but it is limited to an individual fisherman's catch is the way it's worded in the bylaw. And the R6 zone takes that a step further by also allowing retail and wholesale operations. So what we can kind of deduce from that is, since all individual fishers are allowed to sell their own catch, that a retail and wholesale operation therefore must be something more intense than that. So I would expect that a retail and wholesale operation may include an actual storefront that's open to the public, where you've got people that come in, like a fish market, that type of thing. Because the R6 zone is intended to be a little more intense than the R2 zones that surround it, I think some degree of buying other fishers' catch and reselling it as part of that wholesale or retail operation would be permitted under the R6 zone, because it must be more intense than an individual fisher's catch, or else it wouldn't be specifically called out as being permitted in addition to the normal fishery support use. Hopefully I clarified that a little bit, didn't make it more confusing.
So thank you. There was one piece that kind of confuses me a little bit, and I might save it for debate, but just for you, just to clarify again, so with the R6 use, that will allow for retail and wholesale of other fishers catches.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. All right. So I think I have further questions on that, but these might be better questions after debate. So or after the hearing. So I'll save those. Okay. All right. So moving on to opening the public hearing, which I will ask the applicant, I do see Mr. Adams there. Welcome. On behalf of Starfish License Limited, if you would like to take your 10 minutes, and welcome to the crew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of Halifax and West Community Council. And before I begin, I'd like to congratulate Peter on his promotion to being Principal Planner and Development Officer. That's very impressive. Well done.
Correct, yes.
Do we have the slideshow available? Beautiful. Thank you, everybody. And hopefully after this presentation, it'll alleviate all of the concerns that were raised. They were very good questions, and I understand why they were asked. And after you hear this, it will should become more clear. Next slide, please. So the motion before you is that Halifax and West Community Council adopt the amendment to land use bylaw for Planning District 5 is set out in attachment A of the staff report dated September 1st, 2021, and that is what I'll be requesting at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. And Mr. Chris Purcell, who is the applicant, there's the rezoning from P2 to R6, and also again with the adopting of the amendments to land use bylaw. Next slide, please. So there's a history in this, and Mr. Nightingale covered it quite well. It was originally zoned C2. The building on the site was a fire hall, and then it's been a convenience store, an arts and crafts store, and an oil tank outlet as well, which was an authorized use. In 2008, the property was rezoned to P2 to allow for a social club. This was never exercised, this particular zone. And the reason that they wanted it rezoned to P2 was the social club across the street, the licenses were expired and they wanted a property to attach these two. Next, please. So the background in this and how it came to be in March, Mr. Purcell was contacted by Bylaw because on this property he stored fishing gear and a boat, and Bylaw came by and said, you know, you're not to do this, the zone does not allow it. So he called me wondering what to do. So of course we had to bring this into compliance. This was in March, so I just told him what to do. I spoke with Mr. Oliver on a number of occasions, and as always, outstanding response and service from Mr. Oliver. Within a few days, all of the fishing gear was removed, and you just can't pick a boat up and leave it or move it. So within a week, the boat was relocated, and this particular case was closed in April. So here we are now looking for the zoning. Next slide, please. So the policy part, I won't go over this, but as Mr. Nightingale has suggested, that there is policy support for this. There is an R6 zone to the north and the west of it. It's over 7.72 acres, and there's no retail or wholesale fish operation on that. Next slide, please. So there were concerns, and I'll go over those as well. Reefer trucks, which refrigeration trucks, rats, wetlands, commercial uses, and retail wholesale fish sales are concerns that were raised by community members. And I spoke to members of the community when one of my visits to Sambro. There will be no trucks stored in this property. So given that, there'll be no refrigeration units operating. Again, this is simply to store gear. Rats, that issue was raised. And because they'd be attracted to fish and fish products, there'll be no fish, lobster, or other products of the sea stored on this property. It is not going to be used for the wholesale or retail sale of fish products. And the setbacks from the wetlands are heavily regulated by a DOE. And there's not going to be any new building put on here. And again, Mr. Purcell, just from the fact that he wanted to get this in compliance, will comply by any DOE, I guess there's a new term for it, Nova Scotia NSPCC. They'll all be complied with if applicable. Next slide, please. So this is where a lot of the concern that's raised, and this is when Councillor Clary brought this up. Mr. Purcell is a licensed fisher and owns a boat in his name. However, he also owns Ocean View Fisheries, which employs about 50 people. He has a number of locations in Sambro. He leases property from Sambro Fisheries on Lenny's Lane, and he also has property on Old Sambro Road. So there's where some of the confusion lies. People are thinking that he may move some of his commercial uses to this. That is not the intent. That is not going to happen. It's, again, for him as a personal fisher and not as a fish processor. With respect to the wholesale component, his business is wholesaling fish, and he sells right from Newfoundland right down to Boston. So it doesn't make much in the way of sense for him to open up any type of fish wholesaler in this location. And again, not to confuse things, but the Ocean View Fisheries and this property are going to remain as separate entities. The reason that looking for the R6 zone which allows for the retail and wholesale of fish, is that this will allow his son to put a pickup truck in the parking lot. It will eliminate any uncertainty with respect to compliance under the land use bylaw. So we see these trucks along St. Margaret's Bay Road. The example I use is you see on the Bedford Highway where they sell beaver tails. These areas are all zoned to allow this type of sale. This is no different. Next slide, please. So for additional context, and you'll see this in the next slide, there is B4 zone, which is general building. This allows the wholesale and retail sale of fish. And you'll see the two properties Mr. Purcell owns here, which are in close proximity to this. I want to go back to the retail and wholesale fish part. The wholesale fish, he already does that as existing location. There are inherent barriers to the retail sale of fish. You'd have to have a new building. There are operational costs, food handling courses, training, and environmental concerns. Now, there was a slide, slide 12, which Mr. Nightingale had put up. Any discharge that violates provincial regulations would be investigated by DOE. With any fish store, you have to have some way to dispose of your wastewater. There's no storm sewer or any type of sewer. You only have the pond in the back. So inherently, it's impossible to have a retail fish site on the property because there's nowhere to discharge your water. And if you look where Clearwater is and also Fisherman's Market, they're right on the water and they discharge right into the Bedford Basin. Next slide, please. So P2 up on top, the yellow, that is the area or the property that is looking to have rezoned. If you go down toward that red circle, that's Mr. Purcell's existing business, Ocean View Fisheries. That is about 1.1 kilometers away. And on Lenny's Lane, which is properties of Sambro Fisheries, he leases property there. All of these are zoned R4. If he wanted to sell retail fish, he could locate in any of those. And also, if you look at the other red circle on Ketch Harbor Road, or I'm sorry, Old Sambro Road, he owns that property as well, which is zone V4, which would allow for the retail sale of fish. So I'm trying to impress upon everybody that there's no intent of storing any type of vehicles, trucks, reefer units, fish or fish products, or selling them. The R6 is simply to allow a pickup truck to sit and sell lobsters, so people coming in don't have to try to find a particular wharf. They just drive on the road. Next slide, please. So if you look at the conclusions we can draw is that it's designated residential property with fishery support use. It's within residential designation and surrounded by R6 zoning, and the R6 zone is compatible with the surrounding area, and the recommendation supports this application. I request that Halifax and West Community Council approve this request. Next slide. And the obligatory thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm more than willing to answer if I haven't offered enough clarification on the points that were raised earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. I know for me that answered my follow-up question, so appreciate that presentation. Councillor Morse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering if you could share any details about the size of the boat that would be stored on the property, the type of fishing gear, and how much fishing gear might be stored there, please.
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you, Councillor Morse. The boat that was there previously, I believe it was a 44-foot, 11-inch Cape Hollander. And the fishing gear that would be stored would be nets, they'd be lobster traps, no different than some of the slides that Mr. Nightingale had shown. It's a non-obtrusive use. It's non-offensive. It's a fishing community, and R1, R2, R6 all allow for fish uses. And he's Mr. Purcell's no different than other fishers in the community. Many of them have properties zoned appropriately for fishery support use. It's their living, and instead of having to go to a central place, they can just go to backyard or front yard and do what they need to do.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else with questions, clarification? Seeing none in the chat. Thank you, Mr. Adams. We'll move on to the public hearing. So just to review the rules, any member of the public hearing who has registered with the clerk's office on this matter would be given 5 minutes to address the topic. I will call your name. You may unmute your mic and begin speaking. Please start by stating your name and the community of residence. Once your 5 minutes is up, the clerk's office will give you a warning that your time is up. And after you are finished your comments and answer any questions or clarification, please hang up your phone or leave the Zoom meeting and watch the rest of the meeting using the webcast link. This evening, we have 2 registered speakers, and the first speaker is Jane Camsell, and the second is Penny Henneberry. And if Jane, if you are there, I believe I see you.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, and you have 5 minutes. Welcome.
Okay. I live at 1621 Ketch Harbor Road, so I'm just a couple of doors away. I do have a grave number of concerns. I do also wish to rebuke a couple of things that Mr. Nightingale had said. In the photos that he showed, the first photo that he showed with all the pallets and the fishing traps, those are being used as fill. That person wants to fill their property. They are not using them as fishing things. They are using it as free fill, and there's a sign on the front of their property that says so. The second photo that he showed showing the same support for the water was on the water side of Ketch Harbor Road. I have no concerns with having things on the water side of Ketch Harbor Road. I have concerns with things being crossed over Ketch Harbor Road. This road here in front of me is a major throughway. The cars that are going through there at no less than 120. And yes, the speed limit is 50, but that's unfortunately HRM can only see so many policemen down here in a day. And my concern is this building is right within 100 feet of a blind corner where they would come around and they would be right on top of this building's in and out access. And I can see where there will be accidents waiting to happen because of the speed and the volume of traffic. I counted on one day, I had nothing else to do. I counted over 500 cars that went by only between 9 and 4. I counted 150 trucks and stopped counting because I got bored. So the volume of traffic that goes past that area is scary. So I do have some concerns about things coming across onto the north side of Ketch Harbor Road. I do want to rebuke something else that Mr. Nightingale said. He said that the land could not be changed because of the watershed. The people that have owned that property have already done so. They have expanded that property significantly. They did not get permission to do so. And they have expanded the property. You can see by where, if he had shown a picture of the property, you could see by where the post office or the mailboxes are, because that's also where our community mailbox is. So that's more traffic yet going in and out of that freeway there. So I have concerns that that property has already been changed. My biggest concern is the volume of traffic, though, and the fact that it is coming onto the other side of the highway, and there's going to be an accident. It's a given, and I don't think that that area is very big. It's a small property of land, and it is, as you can see from the previous photos, it is abutted by residential properties on all sides, and I do acknowledge the fact that the property that's one house over to the west is a residential 6A or a R6 zoning, but it is an A. And I spoke to the owner and he has never used it for that purpose. So he had the zoning, but he never used it for anything other than residential. The other concern I have is that although we're told there's going to be no refrigeration trucks there, what is there that can stop them from putting temporary refrigeration units up, like Mr. Purcell has done with his other properties? He has units up that are temporary units that are refrigeration units. And given that fishing is a 24/7 operation. There's nothing that's going to stop them from coming in after hours to access that property, whether it's to access equipment or return equipment, or to put fish in their units that they may want to sell the next day. So there's nothing that really stops them from doing that, because it is a 24/7 operation. So my concern is also that with it being a 24/7 operation, how do we know that they won't be going in there with forklifts and trucks to get their equipment at 2 in the morning because they're going to go out at 5 in the morning, which is a normal thing. And that will upset the noise in the area.
10 seconds.
Those were the main concerns.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any questions or clarifications from a member of Community Council? Seeing none, thanks again for joining us this evening, Jane. We'll move on to our next speaker, which is Penny Hannaberry, and I believe I see Penny. Welcome, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Penny Hannaberry. I live at 1628 Ketch Harbor Road. My background is I'm a licensed professional planner with 25 years experience, so my lens is a little different in how I'm looking at this. And I'm going to take the staff report and make a few comments and concerns from that. There's no dispute that the language that allows this to happen is the neighboring R6 zone, but my concern is what prevents this from being a domino effect and the next property becoming R6 and so on. So that's a big concern I have with using that kind of policy within land use planning. And one of the things, the intent of the municipal planning strategy that was never spoken to or mentioned was the intention of protecting existing residential uses. So page 50 and page 52 of the municipal planning strategy is very clear that the intention in the residential designation is to encourage and protect low density residential environment in developed areas. I would classify this as low density developed area, and an R6 zone with some of the uses like the wholesale retail of fish would be impacting that substantially. It is a standalone building not associated with any residential uses, so the impact of that large-scale commercial fishing activities and vehicle maintenance are not permitted, but I have seen that happen on the property with a large semi-truck. The compliance issue, I have, as recently as September, seen the door open to the building and it's still chock-a-block full of materials. And as previously mentioned, the site was enlarged without any permits, from my understanding, because there were no environmental protections put in for the tons of material that were brought in. So I have concerns about what is going to be happening to the property based on what has already been happening, not in compliance. In concerns to the business owner was asked, if the applicant wished to proceed with the application or maybe a different rezoning. They want to proceed to have the greatest flexibility possible to accommodate any future needs of their business. That's in the staff report. That has been asked of the applicant. So again, wholesale retail is a substantial concern. The noise issue regarding the N200 bylaw, the bylaw is very specific. It only refers to trucks and refers to trailers. There were large refrigeration units sitting on the property. Were they just simply there for storage, or were they intended to be attached to the building? The bylaw cannot be enforced the same way if those refrigeration units are attached to the building, because the bylaw is very specific to trucks and trailers and refrigeration associated with that. And the bylaw is not enforceable from a decibel level because HRM's bylaw does not include decibel readings as a means of protecting neighboring property owners from that. The watercourse buffer, I mentioned that there was infilling that already happened. And, the rezoning through the Utility and Review Board, if council does not accept this recommendation, council has the opportunity through planning law to consider and put weight to all of those different things. The bylaw, no one ever mentioned the protection of existing residential uses. This is not the same as somebody moving next to the fish plant and then complaining about noise and smell. This is the opposite. So there was also the mention of this will allow him to park his truck and sell off the back of the truck. Well, the planner just recently answered a question saying that can happen in an R2 zone, that someone can then retail from their property. So if this was an R2 versus an R6, then that truck could still park in the property. So that's a little misleading. And if not used for wholesale and not used for business, then why R6? R2 will allow for the boat, will allow for the traps to be stored, and allow for the equipment. Clearly from the staff report and from the comment from the business owner that, you know, they want to have as much flexibility as possible. So tomorrow it may not be wholesale, but later on it may. And again, parking the truck in the yard with an R2 is permissible based on what the planner said earlier to one of the questions that someone asked. So those are my concerns I put forward.
Thank you very much. Any questions or clarification from members? Seeing none, thank you again, Penny, for joining us this evening, taking the time to share your concerns. So I will give the applicant an opportunity to speak on any of the comments that were raised by our two speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The issue with respect to traffic, I can say quite safely that there will be days when there's not going to be anyone entering or coming out of this property. Bear in mind, this used to be a general store back years ago, and also a small woodworking shop. When you do something with regard to storage, you don't go every day. It's like having a storage locker. You're not there all the time. There was no need for a traffic impact study, which we would have done if it would have been necessary. So the amount of traffic here is not going to be increased significantly. There may be, maybe a trip a day. I dare say it'll be less than that on average. And there were no concerns raised when there's a convenience store there. The mailboxes on site, that's an independent issue. And with regard to the temporary units, again, I'll go back. The reason that the R6 was requested, or we're requesting the R6, is so that we can, let me see here. I'm sorry. So that the property owner can have someone sell lobsters out of the back of their truck. That is the extent of it. He's already has a wholesale business. It makes no sense for him to move any of his operation across the street and down the road when he has the ability to do that on his existing location. And with regard to, this truck's permissible in R1, R2, R6, I'm sure that if he wanted to do that, he could just probably pay somebody to use their property. Again, it's not the intent here. We are not looking to store trucks or reefer units or anything else. This is simply to allow him to store a boat and his fishing gear. If there was a concern about trucks being on here as early as September, then bylaw should have been called, because these trucks, if they were there, would take a while to get rid of. It's not something that you just jump in and take off. So I think that is the, again, in the 24/7 operation, it's already got it doesn't make sense for him to put all his gear on this property and then leave at 5 in the morning and move it all back. He's got a fish plant already in place and a couple of locations on the water, convenient. This to do so otherwise would be inconvenient and not financially feasible. I have sent a note to Mr. Purcell regarding that backfilling. I am not aware that he had done that, but I will find out the circumstances there. I think those are the points that were brought forward. But again, I'll go back one more time to the lobster truck aspect. That's the intent behind the R6, is to allow him to put in a truck to sell lobster to the back. And there are inherent barriers to a retail operation here. So I hope I've answered the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. I see Councillor Morse has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. Just a follow-up question for Mr. Adams. If the proponent has other properties, why doesn't he sell the lobster out of the back of a truck on his other properties?
Because they're off the highway and they're down and they're not on the main road. Like he's got the property on the Ketch Harbor Road property, but you'd be lost amongst all the vehicles that are parked there, who the guys that are workers. You wouldn't know which one to pick. It's more convenient here. That's simply stated. And the other one is off the main road. You couldn't find it on Lenny's Lane.
So there will be some impact on traffic because people will be coming to buy lobster out of the back of the truck.
Yeah, well, they'll be coming to Sambro anyway. But yeah, there will be a little bit for that if they even stop. That's the other thing too. So that's a good question.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Councillor and Mr. Adams. So that is it for questions from members. So I ask to move or close the public hearing.
Move public hearing closed.
Second.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Mason, second by Councillor Cleary. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed say nay. All right, public hearing closed. Councillor Cleary, do you mind putting the motion on the floor, please?
Do not mind at all, Mr. Chair. Just let me bring it up here. I move that Halifax and West Community Council adopt the amendments to the land use bylaw for Planning District 5 as set out in Attachment A of the staff report dated September 1st, 2021.
And seconded by?
I'll second it. Oh, Iona beat me to it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Studdard. Councillor Cleary.
Thank you. Obviously, this isn't my district, but Councillor Cuddle did send me a text. She's not feeling well this evening. And I had mentioned that she had been contacted by residents about the potential for noise, intensity of the use, and those questions were answered to a certain extent. And when I look at what's being asked for here, and I hear what the folks, and I thank them for giving us their thoughts during the public hearing around, you could have a pickup truck, you could store gear, you could store a boat in a lower zone. And perhaps you could, and perhaps there isn't a need at the moment for this property owner to do what they could do under the R6. But even looking at the R6, again, looking at the policy that we have in the municipal planning strategy, it quite clearly states that if you abut a property, especially in an area like this, then you can ask for a rezoning. And so that's why they're here. It's what they're doing. They're not abutting in R2. They're not abutting in R whatever. They abut in R6. In terms of the intensity of the use, given the history of this property as a fire hall, a convenience store, zoned for a social club, didn't become a social club. And then you look at the area, there are other R zones, including R6, there's C2 zones, there's V4 zones immediately there. When you drive down this road and you look at these properties, this is a rural fishing community. That's how it developed. That's what it is. And yes, there may be people there that moved from the city to get some of that country life and peace and quiet, but they've moved into a fishing community and that's where they moved to. And so I personally have no problem with someone getting an R6 on this property. And to look at the concerns raised, and if you do a Google Earth view or a map from Viewpoint is actually probably a better thing to do because it shows the property boundaries. It's a small property. It's a half-acre property. And there's a wetland that covers not quite half the property, which means less than half the property is actually usable. So it's really no bigger than any city property. And when you look at the size of the parking lot, they call it a parking lot, the gravel area beside the garage, I'm not really sure you could park very many trucks on the property. So I'm not sure that's a real concern for folks, given that the property boundaries are very tight along this property. So I respect the fact that this is a rural fishing community, and this person is looking to get zoning for what you would do in a rural fishing community. Have a residential 6 that you could store your gear and boat and park a truck to sell lobster. I see that regularly down Sambro Road, Ketch Harbor, all of the roads down in the area. So I'm fine with this. I'd like to hear what others think in terms of this process and what's being asked for here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other members who have comments or questions, observations? Nobody's in the chat. Nobody's hand is up.
Hands up.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Councillor Stott.
Hi. This is a good presentation on both ends. Just wanted to clarify. So if you're in a residential area and are you allowed to sell fish at that point? As opposed to what we're talking about here?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor's question, the Planning District 5, which is where the Sambro community is, it specifically calls out the fishery as being a really important industry in this community. And so this land use bylaw in this plan area is, I would say, quite a bit more permissive than most other of our land use bylaws are when it comes to the fishery. It's recognized, and so a fishery support use is actually considered a residential use under this land use bylaw. It's and even if it's not run by a person who lives on the property, if you look in the zone, fishery support use is listed under residential uses. So when this bylaw was created, it was anticipated that fishery support use was seen as being compatible with the types of residential uses in this community. So in this community, any residential zone could certainly have a fishery support use. They could sell fish, lobster, whatever off of the back of a truck like that. That was specifically written into land use bylaw to make sure everyone would be allowed to do that.
Okay. And to, I think it was Councillor Clary's point, why do you, if you can already do that, I don't understand, maybe you could explain to me, why would you need to go to an R6 if you're already able to do that?
Thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor's question. Essentially, the request came in to rezone to an R6. Certainly, I think what they're proposing would also be permitted in an R2 zone. If the R2 zone was applied, I think it would still enable what they're doing. That being said, they asked for an R6 zone rather than R2 zone. And when we looked at the policy, the policies are there to support that zone. So really, there's no policy reason why we would not enable that type of rezoning, and that's why our staff recommendation is in favor of it, because the policy supports the R6 zone with what's going on there.
Okay. What is the benefit of having an R6? R2 would be just as feasible.
So the R2 zone, which is, to be clear, that's the base zone in the designation. So everybody in the residential designation is allowed to have an R2 zone. The way the R6 zone came into play in this community is when the land use bylaw was written, at the time, they looked at existing properties that had a more rural residential development pattern, and they laid down a zone that was appropriate. And that was pretty common practice at the time. That's why there's a property across the street that's zoned C2. That's why this property used to be zoned C2, because when the land use bylaw was written, those were the zones that captured what was on the property. So even though the R6 zone isn't one of the base zones in the designation, it was applied to the neighboring property at the time of adoption, and there's policy that allows that to basically be pulled over. Now, in terms of why, what the benefit would be to an R6 rather than R2, when we look at rezoning applications, it's important for us to make sure council knows that they're not limited to what their proposal says. They are limited to what is actually permitted in the zone. So in the staff report, I go into a little bit more detail about the differences between the R2 zone and the R6 zone, because certainly once the R6 zone is applied, they can do anything that's permitted in the zone. And the big differences there, that the things that you can do in the R6 zone that you can't do in an R2 zone, I just have the list up here. Bed and breakfasts, recreation uses, open space uses, agricultural uses, forestry or woodlot uses. And obviously, I would say all of those uses are not likely to materialize on a site like this, which is, as was pointed out, it's quite small. And also the site is really not likely well suited to a residential, like a dwelling use. It's a small property, it's on a wetland, very limited amount of space for a new on-site septic system that would support residential uses. So as part of our policy analysis, we kind of look at what's a reasonable adaptive reuse of an existing building. And I think it's probably fair to say that given the size of this property and other factors, redeveloping it for residential uses is probably not likely to happen. And so that lends a little bit of weight to the R6 consideration. And the other big difference between R6 and R2 is that the R6 does allow the retail and wholesale of fish. Now, I know the applicant said that that's not their intention, but to be clear, it will be permitted under the zoning if it's given the R6 zone. Does that answer your questions about that, Councillor?
So they can sell fish. Okay. So they have the ability to sell fish with the at the back of trucks and lobster because of the R6. Okay.
And if they were given an R2 zone, they could also do that off the back of a truck.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been going back and forth on this all night because it does seem, why ask for more than you need? Why not ask for R2 if you're just going to sell it on the back of a truck? But then at the same time, if the owner of the property came in and asked to restore the C2 zoning, there would be no logical reason to not allow that. And it seems to me that if it was once a convenience store and once had that traffic and not that long ago, and then, but the focus here is potential future fisheries support uses. I certainly face that in my district on a slightly larger scale, the increase in use of the Halifax port and the increased pace of operations in the Halterm PSA terminal makes people who live nearby upset as people who live in a residential neighborhood. But we want to support, it's a key component of what makes Halifax special and of our economic growth is our ocean's advantage. And it's all these things, from fisheries to shipping to the ocean supercluster. I don't see anything in the land use bylaw and the NPS that would tell me that staff has made a mistake here. I think that this is a rezoning that is appropriate and allowable underneath under the NPS as written. The concerns that I've heard that are real are handled through other processes, the noise bylaw and the Department of Environment, if there was infilling that was not permitted and allowed. And I know that's not satisfying. It's never satisfying. And I understand that to the residents, and I'm sorry. But I just don't feel that those are reasons why I would have to go against the staff recommendation. So I will be supporting the staff recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. Councillor Morse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I just want to say that it's a pretty rare use in many communities to have viable fisheries still in communities where people are living and working every day. So I think it's important that we support those traditional livelihoods in communities that we have in HRM. So I will be supporting this as well. I do find this a curious one, just the way the zoning has this what's being asked for here. But I think the most important thing is that we're being asked to provide a modest use here that will support economic activity that's been a mainstay for generations. So I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cleary, second time.
Thank you, and thank you, colleagues, and thank you for everyone who's participated in the public hearing so far. This is a weird one. I mean, I've already said my piece about in terms of the my initial go about supporting it, but I live on Quinpool Road. And so, for me to talk about fishing use in rural context is interesting. And Councillor Morse talked about the privilege it is. My family's from Newfoundland. And I remember when the cod fishery collapsed and then Fisheries Minister John Crosbie shut her down, and the wrath that he took from fishing communities. And so, it's one of those things where this is one of the things I cherish about HRM, Halifax Regional Municipality, is we are a regional municipality. And the fact that, most of us, and it's unfortunate that Councillor Cuddle is sick this evening, most of us live in a very urban context. Councillor Stoddard might be the closest thing, but she's got lots of beautiful and pristine nature in her backyard, not fisheries. And so, having us discuss this is one of those things where we look at our land use bylaws and the different districts and regions that we have, and really appreciate the diversity, the breadth of our community, and how that actually, I think, makes us much stronger than many other cities. So I just want to thank everyone in this process and just say that about, what a great municipality Halifax is. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And that's a great note to call for the question.
Question.
Questions have been called. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed say nay. Seeing none, that passes. Again, thank you to Mr. Nightingale for presenting our applicant and our speakers this evening. Try to navigate my screen here. So we dealt with mostly, I think, if not everything. Am I correct, Mr. Clerk?
Yes, that is correct. Next item, and the only item left, is item 17, public participation.
Okay, great. So this is the public participation aspect of the meeting. As a reminder, in order to have signed up as a speaker, deadline was 4:30 the business day prior to the hearing. And we currently have no speakers signed up for this meeting. Our next meeting is November 16th, 2021. And with all things going according to plan, fingers crossed, I believe that's in person, Ms. Clerk?
Shh, don't jinx it. You said that last time.
You were so, you know what? It came with my mouth and you were so right, because I said that and look where we ended up. So I won't say that again. And next meeting is November 16th, 2021, and call for adjournment.
Motion to adjourn.
All right. Thank you, Councilor Mason. We are adjourned. Appreciate you, everyone. Thank you, Councilor Morris, for holding it down for the moment.